Well, good evening. Welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Austin Sheridan, and I'm delighted to be joining you for the first time tonight. Tonight we are joined by William Duguid. He is a writer and activist, and he works in the Perth and Kinross Yes Hub. William, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks very much, Austin, and good luck with your first show.
Thank you very much, William. I'm sure you'll be gentle with me. So we'll just move on now, and we'll do the Ukrainian update, day 876. Germany plans to halve its military aid to Ukraine in 2025 to £4 billion, despite concerns over continued US support. According to a draft budget seen by Reuters. Instead, the German government hopes Ukraine will be able to meet the bulk of its military needs with 50 billion in loans from proceeds of frozen Russian assets approved by the G7, and that funds earmarked for armaments will not be fully used. Germany has faced criticism for repeatedly missing a NATO target of spending 2% of its GDP on defence, but aims to comply by 2025. Trump's choice of JD Vance as his running mate is bad for us. It's terrible news for Ukraine. A senior European diplomat in Washington is reported to have told journalists. Vance is not our ally. Senator Vance was one of the leading opponents of the new assistance package to Ukraine last spring and has expressed indifference to what happens in that war, said Michael McFall, the director at the Freeman Smuggler Institute for International Studies and former ambassador to Russia. Ukraine's defence minister said it would find a way to battle Russia's invading force even if Donald Trump won a second term. Speaking remotely to Aspen Security Forum in Colorado, Rustem Umrov said, "We believe in US leadership and we believe America wants its partners and allies to be strong as well. At this stage, we will focus on the battlefield." Umrov said, "Whatever the outcome of the US elections, we will find solutions." Umrov pushed back against the Biden administration's restrictions on Ukraine firing US weapons into Russia. Biden suggested at the NATO summit that Ukraine might use them to hit Moscow. Umrov said Ukraine could not stop Russian strikes on its own cities and infrastructure unless it could hit the air bases and other military sites in Russia from which the strikes come. A Russian man has been jailed for 3 years in the US for smuggling American-made military-grade microelectronics to Russia. Maximum Marchenko, 52, pled guilty, was also sentenced to 3 years of supervised release after he gets out. The Justice Department said Magrenko and 2 Russian co-conspirators were accused of using shell companies conceal fraudulent procurement of OLED micro displays used in rifle scopes, night vision goggles, thermal optics, and other weapon systems. Russia is ready to work with any US leader willing to engage in equitable, mutually respectful dialogue. Sergei Lavrov said on Wednesday the Russian Foreign Minister welcomed the stance on Ukraine of JD Vance, a Republican vice presidential candidate. Ukraine and Russia have exchanged 95 prisoners of war each. Vladimir Zelensky, Ukraine's president, and the Russian defence ministry reported the exchange on Wednesday. The swap was the 54th since Russia launched a full-scale invasion in February 2022. Estonia and Lithuania will no longer allow Belarus-registered cars to enter through checkpoints on their borders with Russia or Belarus because of EU sanctions. So, what is it you make of that so far, William?
I've spoken on the Ukraine situation in just about every broadcast, and it's always a very uncertain situation. And I sense right now a fair bit of nervousness in Ukrainian circles about what's going to happen with the presidential election in the US.
Yeah.
And the recognition that JD Vance is now the running mate for Donald Trump, and Donald Trump, of course, is looking a pretty solid bet at the minute after the events of the weekend, certainly to have increased profile in the coming election. I think that does denote a fair bit of nervousness about what might happen in terms of the US's commitment in the event of a Trump presidency to continuing to assist Ukraine. Trump has said, of course, that if he is president, the Ukraine war will be over in short order, and that need not necessarily be good news for Ukraine. We would just have to wait and see how the early days of a Trump presidency panned out. So, yeah, quite important for Zelensky to be continuing to shore up European support, which he's been doing today at Blenheim Palace. We may mention that event later on. There are straws in the wind, such as Germany cutting back on its direct aid, that maybe that won't be an altogether easy path without such intervention. We'll just have to see if Germany's calculation that the proceeds of Russian asset sales will help to shore Ukraine up with loans enough to be able to conduct the war. So, as ever, a chaotic and uncertain situation, and no obvious end in sight, except, of course, in the event of that Trump presidency.
Yeah, absolutely, and we will touch on both those subjects a bit later on in the show. But what we'll do now is we'll go into another conflict, which is the Israel-Gaza conflict. That will just read through some things for you. So the Gaza Health Ministry has said that 38,848 Palestinians have been killed, and 89,459 people injured since October 7th. National religious recruits challenge values of the IDF, which once dominated by secular elites. Now 2/5 of infantry graduate officer cadets now come from section of Israel society, aligned with far-right parties and settler movement. About 40% of those graduating from the Army's infantry officer schools now come from a national religious community that accounts for 12 to 14% of Jewish Israeli society, and is politically more aligned with Israel's far-right and far-right political parties. And the settler movement, critics change that its growing influence, including from the more orthodox portion known as Fardalam, is pursuing its own agenda with the army. Israel's extremist national security minister has visited the holiest Muslim site in Jerusalem, recording a video saying he went to pray in a provocative move as he seeks to disrupt ceasefire talks. Itamar Ben-Gvir, and ultra-nationalist champion of the secular movement, recorded footage as Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, also known as Temple Mount, a site holy to Muslims and Jews. The United Nations has confirmed receiving reports of structures belonging to Palestinians being demolished in Jericho and the occupied West Bank. The Wafa news agency earlier cited local sources as saying 4 buildings were demolished in Jericho, and notice to destroy others was issued in a town north of Jerusalem. Since 2009, the UN has recorded 11,081 Palestinian-owned structures being demolished by Israeli forces, displacing more than 17,000 people. The United Nations denounced an Israeli government spokesperson for calling the head of its agency for Palestine refugees, UNRWA, a terrorist sympathiser. Stephanie Dulac, spokesman for UN Security General Antonio Guterres, said the comments made by Israel's David Mencer were downright dangerous. The UN's Agency for Palestine Refugees says only 10 out of its 26 health centres are currently operational in the Gaza Strip, aimed sustained Israel attacks on healthcare facilities in the enclave. Just give me a moment to fix my earpiece, but William, if you're able just to tell me your thoughts on that.
The same stories recur with each broadcast here. The UNWRA situation is it's a continuation of the harassment that organisation has suffered, both in terms of its reputation being trashed, resources, but also in the continuing lack of support from some Western countries ever since, I think, patently over-egged allegations about terrorist sympathisers within UNWRA surfaced a few months ago. And that funding in many cases has never been restored. And then lately, of course, one of their headquarters has been destroyed, and their capacity to do their job has been greatly reduced. Meanwhile, we continue in search of some way of approaching a ceasefire, but increasingly one senses that the Israelis' heart is not in it. And as you said, a very provocative appearance from Mr. Ben Gvir at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and also statements from Benjamin Netanyahu in the last week suggest that we're a long way from an agreed peace. And certainly if the Israeli side were to propose a particular form of peace, one suspects it would not be very advantageous at all to the Gaza side of things, and indeed to the people. So one despairs to hear the continuing news, and it just keeps coming through every day. And this is another example of something where a solution needs to be found, but nobody seems to be willing to address the hard issues to make that ceasefire happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As I say, it is a very sad state of affairs. What we'll do is we'll move on to the next topic, which is going to be the King's Speech debate. All right. So the King's Speech debate continued in the House of Commons today, discussing foreign affairs and defence. The SNP has tabled an amendment to the King's Speech to scrap the two-child cap after Keir Starmer failed to include this in his programme for government. The amendment in the name of SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn has already received cross-party support with the backing of the SNP, Plaid Cymru, Green Party, SDLP, Alliance Party and independent MPs including Jeremy Corbyn. If chosen by the Speaker, the amendment would go to a vote next week. It comes aimed a backlash against Keir Starmer's cynical attempts to kick the issue into the long grass by launching a task force instead of simply scrapping the two-child cap immediately. New figures published by Child Poverty Action Group last week found 1.6 million children are impacted by the Labour government's two-child benefit cap, with families losing up to $3,455 a year per child. The charity found 300,000 children would be lifted out of poverty, and a further 700,000 children would be in least deep poverty if the two-child cap was abolished. In June, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, IFS, published its own analysis warning the two-child limit would affect 670,000 additional children by the end of this Parliament unless it's scrapped. Commenting, SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn said, "The Labour government's two-child benefit cap is pushing thousands of Scottish children into poverty and is a disgrace and must be scrapped immediately. It's shameful that Keir Starmer has made the political choice to continue imposing Tory austerity cuts instead of delivering the change that people in Scotland were promised. The Labour government shouldn't need a task force to find a consensus and do the right thing. This is a cynical attempt to kick the issue in the long grass which won't wash with voters. For every day that Starmer differs and delays, more children will suffer the consequence of Labour inaction. The cap must go now." So, William, what do you make of the Labour government not including the scrapping of the two-child cap in the King's Speech, like many Labour MPs suspected that Keir Starmer might do?
I think it's a very unfortunate choice to have made. Everybody knows that the two-child cap has been a severe driver of poverty in the least well-off families. And it's interesting that it was termed the Labour two-child benefit cap because, of course, it was introduced by the Tories. It seems to me that it would have been a relatively low-hanging fruit for Labour to say, yep, we will abolish this. They're obviously expecting a long honeymoon period on other fronts if they can afford not to take this particular decision. It does cost money, that's absolutely true, but it's put in people's hands is not necessarily lost money because it helps the economy move around. It may even assist growth. So it's not just giving money away for no good result. So I doubt very much that if the amendment is taken, it will be voted in. I don't think with that size of majority, the result would be any different. But it perhaps sets the tone for what this Labour government of supposed change is actually going to be about, which is actually very little change at all.
Because that's what I was going to ask, because when we listed the parties there, right, so say for example the SNP, Plaid Cymru, Green Party, SDLP Alliance Party and independent MPs, I mean they only add up to 26 members of Parliament in the House of Commons. And then if you look at other parties that have said they would look at abolition, that would be the Liberal Democrats, even the Forum, have suggested that they would back it. That would still leave us short of 182 MPs needed to reach 322. That's with the exclusion of the 7 Sinn Féin MPs and the Speaker. So really, for this to be enabled, if the SNP amendment is to be successful, really what we're looking to do is to persuade Labour MPs such as Kim Johnson, and Mary Kelly Foy, who are Labour MPs that have spoken about wanting to push for an immediate abolition. How successful do you think that the SNP and the other parties could be at persuading those backbench Labour MPs to do the right thing and vote to remove the two-child cap?
Well, there are a lot of Labour MPs, and that means that there are a lot of people competing for available jobs. And it probably isn't a good idea to be pissing off the leadership at this point by making a stance on something, if you want the cynical, if you like, practical view of things. So I don't think there's really any particular chance that any amendment to try and abolish the two-child cap is going to do anything with the vast majority of Labour MPs at this stage. Come back to it in a year and things might be different, because by that time the honeymoon period will be over, not least with the Labour MPs themselves, and some of them will have realised that maybe they're not going to get a job. It's because there are so many of them, and maybe it's time to be a wee bit more forthright about standing up for what's actually right. The opinion polls might also be driving things by then as well, but not at the moment, I'm afraid.
Do you think that any Scottish MPs will follow in a Salvers call to scrap the cap, or do you think that as you've mentioned there, because they could be jockeying for jobs essentially, that they'll fall behind Keir Starmer and ignore their Scottish leader?
I think you never know. There might be one or two, but I wouldn't have thought so. Jobs weren't exactly being doled out to the cadre of Labour MPs from Scotland, of whom a large number are absolute newbies. So the same things will be constraining them, I think.
Excellent. So the other thing that we're going to discuss as well today, that will affect Scotland, it's going through the House of Commons, is going to be the railway bill. So in the House of Commons today, the new Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh, launched the UK Government's Passenger Railway Service Public Ownership Bill, which would make provision for passenger railway services to be provided by public sector companies instead of by means of franchise. The bill will allow for the UK Government to return railway companies to public ownership and their current franchised end, or if companies surrender their franchise. ScotRail is not expected to be affected by this legislation, has already been nationalised by the Scottish Government, but it's unclear what, if any, effect it will have on Network Rail's operations in Scotland. So just thinking about Network Rail, that is currently, reserved to Westminster. Do you think that when this bill's going through, that we have maybe an opportunity to maybe devolve some of that infrastructure? And what do you think, William, could potentially happen with other rail services, such as, say, for example, TransPennine Express or or Avanti, that do cross-border rail? Where do you think the dice could fall with that?
I think there are already, I think, is it 4 companies out of 14 are in, if you like, special measures, and they'll be nationalised fairly rapidly. The others will be nationalised as their current deal runs out. And I think there may also be the provision, this is just a proposal at the minute, but there will be the provision to take over their roles should they get into difficulty in future. And that's a perfectly possible outcome. As far as Great British Railways goes, I expect that it will simply replace Network Rail all over the UK. Does Labour have any appetite to do any additional devolution of anything in Scotland? Does it have any incentive to do so? I'm not convinced that it does. If it had a majority of 20, then maybe it would. But if it has a majority the size that it does, I may be wrong about this, and I'll be very happy to admit it if so, but I don't think they'll be queuing up to devolve new stuff to Scotland. So Great British Railways will become the instrument of the track and infrastructure in Scotland, just as it is in the rest of the UK, I think.
Yeah, because obviously, when it comes to like a wide range of issues, so for example, the name, for example, Great British Railways, sometimes, during the campaign, you could be mistaken to think that, that all railways, across the UK, were under private ownership, when the reality is in Scotland, the SNP government, have, that we nationalised those railways a few years ago. So do you think that maybe it could be seen as a bit disingenuous to call it Great British Railways, considering that they won't be operating any trains in Scotland?
Um, it could be disingenuous, but it's the branding. It's the branding you've seen throughout. They didn't make it explicit in Scotland. They didn't have the Union Jack behind the change logo, for example.
Mhm.
But the example of GB Energy, it's the same thing. There is a branding. We are resetting the union, I think, and Scotland may not entirely like that process, but it's certainly, I think, on Keir Starmer's agenda big time. And it's something that we're going to have to watch. And those of us in the independence movement are going to have to particularly try and highlight to people and to point out when it's happening, because I don't think the people will particularly like it either.
Yeah, well, talking about reset, William, the next topic that I want to discuss is exactly on that measure of reset. Because Sir Keir Starmer has promised European leaders that he will reset Britain's ties with the countries as Prime Minister, uses his first international summit in the UK to try and draw a line under years of fictitious relations with continental Europe. The Prime Minister used his opening speech at the European Political Community Summit at Belgium Palace today to reassure the leaders of more than 40 other countries that he wanted to renew the trust and friendship with them. UK ministers are hoping to use the summit as a chance to explore future talks on migration and trade, with Starmer hoping to reach new deals with the EU on returning asylum seekers and trading defence and agricultural products. European leaders arriving at the summit said they were largely optimistic about the chances of renegotiating parts of the UK's relations with the EU. Joseph Borrell, the EU's chief diplomat, said, "We welcome the new tone of the British government and we look forward to engaging with it. We are ready to reinforce our foreign and security policy cooperation." Charles Michel, the president of the European Council, said, "On the field of migration, we can see how we can deepen the ties and how we can cooperate together." Now, just on that, William, just to add in, I mean, what they've also been saying is there isn't any chance to obviously renegotiate the Brexit deal. Obviously, we know, Keir Starmer said that he doesn't want us, for example, to rejoin the single market. He doesn't want us to rejoin the common travel area. So how much change do you think that this Labour government can really, bring with Europe? And do you think it will make a substantive difference?
I think they're going to have to do quite a lot of different things to make a difference. I do think there will be a change of tone with Europe. And I think probably that those who've been at the European Political Community Summit are recognising that. That said, to have a better tone with Europe was a fairly low bar to climb over. So I don't think that really means all that much. It's really quite important what Labour does on other fronts with regard to the effects of Brexit. For example, European funding, which has disappeared, was never adequately replaced by the Tory government. And I suspect that Labour has no plans, again, because it's too expensive if you're following the fiscal rules, to improve that. So, in terms of what we, the British people, feel and what we experience, I don't think we'll be seeing very much at all. We really need to properly have a relationship as we used to have, and that we now remember as the norm. We need things like certainly as close to the single market as you can get. We need freedom of movement, which is, it works both ways, and it's therefore our freedom of movement that's restricted. And I'd like to see more going on in these lines. In terms of asylum seekers and migration, it is perfectly valid to be discussing how the whole European community deals with asylum seekers, to make sure that there are robust systems in place to make sure that they are dealt with justice, compassion, and everything that's required. But in terms of smashing the gangs and stopping the boats, one way of stopping the boats, which is not, I think, a highlight Labour thing, but certainly it's in there, is to have an asylum system that's fit for purpose, so that seekers' claims are quickly dealt with and there are robust procedures for returning them to Europe once they get here through perfectly legal and perfectly safe means. No sign of that just yet.
Mm-hmm. I suppose that what we have seen, William, I suppose, just to be fair, as a step change, and maybe how Labour have approached some things. So, for example, we've seen how awful it was that Tory ministers were demanding, that cartoons were painted over, in an immigration centre because they felt it was too welcoming. We're talking about children here. But then now Sir Keir Starmer, has stopped the flights to Rwanda, which obviously is now going to feed in, to how the UK approaches immigration and those discussions with Europe. In terms of the Rwanda policy itself being dropped by Sir Keir Starmer, what do you feel about that? And do you think that will help these conversations that we're going to be having with Europe, over the months and years ahead when it comes to dealing with migration?
Well, to give him due credit, yes, he is getting rid of the Rwanda policy, which was a nonsense from the start, and maybe a fresh start, and it is a form of change. Very good. Um, whether it will actually have that effect on the number of people undertaking difficult and dangerous journeys is another matter. How it's perceived in Europe, I think it is a fairly reasonable side that shows perhaps a more cooperative approach to come. So, yeah, you're probably right in saying a step change, and I'm probably being a bit uncharitable, but I, I think Labour needs to be measured in the months to come by what actually happens and what it actually does, rather than the slightly slogan-led thing we've been seeing both in the King's speech and also in some of the statements being made today. But yeah, credit where it's due. It is an improvement with regard to Rwanda.
Excellent. So, so next subject I would like to talk about, OB, is another important one, for people across the world. And the former Health Secretaries Jeremy Hunt and Matt Hancock have been criticised for their failure to better prepare the UK for the pandemic, and a damaging first report from the COVID inquiry that calls for an overhaul in how the government prepares for civil emergencies. Hunt, who was the Health Secretary from 2012 to 18, and Hancock, who took over until 2021, were named by the chair of the inquiry, Heather Hollett, for failing to rectify flaws in the contingency planning before the pandemic, which claimed more than 230,000 lives in the UK. The government has focused largely on the threat of influenza outbreak, despite the fact coronaviruses in Asia and the Middle East the preceding years meant another coronavirus outbreak at a pandemic scale was foreseeable. Lady Hallett said that to overlook that was a fundamental error. It was not a black swan event, Hallett said in a 240-page report. It concluded the processes, planning and policy of the civil contingency structures within the UK government and devolved administrations and civil services failed their citizens. Ministers and officials were guilty of groupthink that led to a false consensus that the UK was well prepared for a pandemic. Never again can a disease be allowed to lead so many deaths and so much suffering. Among the former Senior Court of Appeal judges' recommendations were the leader or deputy leader of each of the four nations should chair a cabinet-level committee responsible for civil emergency preparedness, a UK-wide pandemic response exercise should run at least every 3 years, and a new UK-wide whole system civil emergency strategy be put in place. External red teams should regularly challenge the principles, evidence and advice on emergency plans. An independent statutory body should be established to advise the UK government and devolved administrations and consult with voluntary groups and council-based directors of public health on civil emergency preparedness and response. The findings about the UK's pandemic preparedness are the first from the statutory inquiry into COVID-19 and were based on 6 weeks of hearings last summer, as well as the disclosure of thousands of documents. Now, obviously, William, COVID-19, affected a lot of people, and for lots of people, they did lose their loved ones. So a very sensitive subject, and obviously quite a damning report there. Really, it doesn't seem that any government got it right within the United Kingdom. What would your response be to those findings? And do you think that now that has been published, then that we will see good responses from government in getting their act together on these things?
I think the government owes it to us to make sure there's a good response to it. It doesn't pull any punches at all. The UK was nowhere near ready for the COVID outbreak. It had, I think, ceased to pour the resources into pandemic preparedness as early as 2016. It was really throwing a dice when it did that. And then such preparedness as there was, prepared for entirely the wrong disease. They were planning for flu and they didn't get anything of the sort. It wasn't a dead cert that it would be a coronavirus next, but I think you need to keep all the possible outcomes or possible circumstances out there as things you are planning for, and they certainly didn't do that. And that is just the preparedness beforehand. The lack of preparedness then was like a thread through the first part of the response, and the response was never particularly coherent. Yes, it does touch on the response of all the UK governments, but I do think that at the UK macro level, that's where the preparedness needs to be. And these sound like fairly sensible steps, and I would hope that the incoming government will make sure that they're in place. And one particular aspect of it that's kind of hinted at is how the nations of the UK operate together, how they communicate with each other. Because for me, that was one of the things that was lacking all too often. The other nations were meant to just follow what Westminster did. And indeed, there was annoyance should we hold a press conference before they did. It should be much more coordinated than that. And the nations, which have perhaps different requirements or different stages in the pandemic, should be able to do their own thing within something that's talked about every day by all of them. And that is the sort of setup that Lady Hallett seems to be envisaging. And I very much hope that that is what happens from now on.
Brilliant, William. Thank you so much. That was a very robust answer. So because of that, I feel that we can move on, to our next wee topic, which we did touch a little bit on earlier. So President Biden has reported to be more open to hearing arguments that he should step aside as the Democratic presidential candidate after the party's two main congressional leaders told him they doubted his ability to beat Donald Trump. While continuing to insist he will be the party's nominee in November, the president is said to have started asking questions about negative polling data and whether Vice President Kamala Harris, considered the favourite to replace him if he were to withdraw, fares better. The indications of a possible rethink come after Biden tested positive on Wednesday for COVID-19, forced him to isolate for several days, while curtailing a campaigning visit to Nevada that has been part of a drive to show his candidacy was very much alive. It also coincides with fresh polling data showing that he now trails Trump by 2 points in Virginia, a state he won by 10 points in 2020. The Emerson College polling, the House survey showed that Trump ahead by 45% to 43%, within the margin of error, but consistent with a spate of other polls showing that Biden's support has fallen in swing states since his disastrous showing at last month's debate in Atlanta. President Biden's willingness to listen to opposing arguments comes after Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, And Hankin Jeffries, the Democrat leader in the House of Representatives, reportedly both told him that it would be in the country's interest if he stepped aside, ABC reported. So as we know, there has been a number of gaffes, and there's been people that I've seen in social media that are saying, that they feel sorry for him, that they just think that he might not be cognitive. What's your opinions on it, William? Do you think that he is going to be the presidential candidate? Is Kamala Harris the best person to replace him? Or would you have another suggestion potentially if he were to be replaced?
I learned the lesson of never advising Americans about what to do with their own political system a long time ago. I some American friends have had some interesting conversations with them. Joe Biden, I'm not sure about the cognitive difficulties. I suspect that some of them may be related to how he's coping with his long-held stammer, for example. I do think that everybody slows down greatly in old age. Donald Trump isn't far behind him in terms of age. There may be a hint of Parkinsonism and some of his stiffness when he walks, perhaps, and possibly also there's a sort of stiffness of the facial expression. But I am no doctor. What I do know is that it's very unlikely to be a good idea to subject somebody of that age, and I would include Trump in the same bracket, to probably the most stressful job in the world. It makes no sense at all. And I think, although Joe Biden can't do a U-turn, he's beginning to prepare the ground for a possible withdrawal from that election. And I think if he were to do that, it would ensure probably that he saw out the rest of his life in reasonable health. And that in itself would be a good thing. I think pushing him into standing is an act almost of elder abuse. As for who would then stand against Trump, not convinced that Kamala Harris can actually make much of a dent in Trump's lead. I also think that the American people are not necessarily ready to elect a woman as president, but particularly a woman as president who hasn't made a great impression in 3.5 years as vice president. I think if they are going to look for someone else, there's obviously the sensational choice you can make, such as Michelle Obama, but the same objections might apply to her. But it would be one of the younger potential candidates, somebody like Gavin Newsom. They might have to go down that kind of road. But you don't change candidates at this stage in the game and get a great benefit from it. It didn't work for the Democrats in 1968, and I don't think it's going to work now. So whatever they do, I think all things being equal, we will be seeing Trump riding high in the polls all the way to the start of November.
Yeah. Well, as I say, it is very interesting there, that you mentioned Michelle Obama, because I've seen a lot of kind of speculation on there, in terms of maybe her being, a potential candidate. But I suppose, William, do you think, just because she was married to one of the most powerful politicians in the world, do you think there's been a wee bit of an assumption that just because she was the First Lady, that she actually has those kind of political ambitions?
Well, amongst First Ladies, she probably has some of the attributes that would fit. But there's no way of telling whether she's got the full set of attributes. Also, there's no way of telling whether she has any interest at all in actually becoming president. She knows what being president is like in terms of the strain on, if you like, the household and the relationship and all that. And maybe she just doesn't want to go through that again. So it would be a highly speculative thing to do. And I don't think that's what they will do, but it still is an intriguing possibility.
Excellent. So what we'll do is I'm going to move on to our next little topic of discussion. So applications are now open for innovative companies based in Scotland to join Offshore Renewable Energy ORE Catapult's award-winning Launch Academy programme. Launch Academy is an industry-backed technology accelerator programme designed to support commercialisation of new technologies that will enhance the UK's offshore wind supply chain, enabling greater local content while supporting cost reduction. The prestigious Launch Academy was established in 2020, and this will be the inaugural Scotland-wide programme, which will provide 10 early-stage businesses with technology development and business growth support to help them to accelerate the commercialisation of products and services targeting the UK and global offshore wind markets. Since 2020, Launch Academy has supported 57 companies, raised 26.7 million in private investment, 8.4 million grant funding and had 150 patents fielded through both the national and regional Launch Academy programmes across the United Kingdom. Launch Academy Scotland is sponsored by Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, South of Scotland Enterprise, Global Renewable Energy Developers Blueflow Energy, NADRA Partnership, Ocean Winds, as well as Inchcape Offshore Wind Farm. The 10 most promising solutions will be selected by a panel of experts to join Launch Academy Scotland cohort. Industry experts from the sponsoring organisations will engage and support cohort companies throughout their 7-month Launch Academy journey. At the end of the programme, the innovators will pitch to industry partners, and ORE catapults network of investors with the aim of securing investment, a route to market for their products. Dr. Stephen Waite, Director of Strategy and Emerging Technologies at ORE Catapult, said our Launch Academy was established in 2020 to accelerate early stage disruptive innovations which can address the challenges facing the offshore renewables sector. I'm delighted that we have the dedicated programme for Scotland linked so closely to the biggest offshore wind projects in our waters. So, William, what do you make of that? Do you think we're going to see lots of innovative things coming forward through that? How do you feel about that initiative?
Well, it's a good initiative. It's been a good initiative since 2020. The aspects of support and mentoring are very important. I just think that with Scotland's obvious strength in the offshore sector, what took them so long to create a Scotland-specific programme for it? I dare say some Scottish companies maybe have benefited from the UK-wide one, but maybe this is something that should have been in place before. But I'm glad it's there now. It looks like an excellent thing. It's not a massive number of companies per year if you look at 57 since 2020, but nevertheless, it's a fair slug of money, and it will keep Scotland, I would very much hope, at the forefront of the renewables revolution, which I think is only just getting underway, and that can only be to our benefit.
Absolutely, thank you so much for that, William. And now to move on to another good news story, because everybody does like safer communities. Police Scotland have welcomed 255 new officers who have taken their oath of office at services across Scotland today. The officers were sworn in at regional training centres in the communities they will deploy to after their training. Chief Constable Joe Farrell said taking the oath of office is a significant moment of our latest recruits. They are signing up to a hugely rewarding and demanding career where people will turn to them for help, often in the most critical and vulnerable circumstances. Taking on the responsibilities and duties of a police officer is a deeply considered decision, and I thank every one of them for stepping forward to help safeguard Scotland's communities. The officers will be ready to deploy to communities on the 4th of November this year. And a first for Police Scotland non-residential training is being trialled to facilitate officers with caring demands and responsibilities, allowing them to return home each day. The opportunity to complete the majority of training in a non-residential setting can provide real benefit for those who would otherwise have been unable to consider a role in policing. The trial will be evaluated for future delivery of Police Scotland's ongoing recruitment drive. So not only are we welcoming there, William, 255 new officers, but a new approach, to how we are training officers, and to make that, more open to people that maybe find themselves in maybe slightly more challenging circumstances. William, do you think this is a good step forward? And are you pleased to see there's more officers being introduced on the streets of Scotland?
It's clearly a an innovation, that the trial of the non-residential training. And if that is indeed helping to recruit police officers who wouldn't otherwise have been recruited, that's a very good thing. It's good to see 255 new police officers. Over the period 2007 to 2023, the number of police officers in Scotland, first of all, which started below where it is now, went rapidly up between 2007 and I think 2010. It then was round about the mid to late 17,000s until 2020 or thereabouts, and since then it's been on a downward slope. So anything that can arrest that downward slope is a good thing. I think this particular influx, we don't know how many people simultaneously or in the last year have left the police service, but this particular influx, all other things being equal, will nudge the number of police officers in Scotland back up to the midpoint of where it's been in the last 17 years. And that's a good thing. And it's clear that they're looking carefully at how they can get more, and maybe the non-residential training is an aspect of that. We shall see.
Absolutely, William. And and I'm going to ask you, just to hold on there with me, because we are coming to the end of the programme, and when you're having such good discussions and and such well-bodied answers, time does run away from you. But from a personal perspective, William, what I want to do is to thank you for making my very first show on here as as easy as possible. So you've been absolutely brilliant, and I really do appreciate that. I believe that you have helped me, kind of just go over my initial nerves, William. As you can imagine, it's quite a daunting thing. Never done this kind of thing before, and you've been absolutely brilliant. If you can just hold on there, there with me. Sorry, William, on you go.
I was going to say thank you, and yes, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to your second, third, fourth, etc., and onwards shows.
Excellent, and you know what? And I look forward to hopefully at some point in the future being able to interview and seek your views again. I'm going to say it has been an extremely enjoyable experience for me. But as I say, just hold on there just now, because I am going to come back to you just to formally thank you, because that is all we do have time for this evening. But before I go, I want to remind you that broadcasting Scotland would depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Right now, we are urgently needing to increase our donations if we are to be able to pay for our bills. We face the cost of over £4,000 every month, but our income is just over £2,000 a month, and we are now facing mounting debts. Please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you, and thank you again to our guest, William Duguid. He's been absolutely fantastic. Again, we do appreciate you coming on. We do appreciate you giving up your time to speak to us and making our show that wee bit more special, William, as you always do. So thank you for that. And
thank
goodbye.
You very much.
Thank you very much, William. And to everyone who is watching and listening, goodbye. And thank you very much for watching. Take care.